Welcome, everyone. I hope you are here for Let History Speak. This is a film screening and a conversation with Ann McColl, one of our dear friends who's worked with us at Public Schools First for well over a decade. And we're so really pleased to have her here with us. Ann is an attorney and known by many throughout the country as a constitutional educational law scholar. Um, Ann has served in lots of capacities in public education. She was the legal counsel to the North Carolina Association of Educators. She also worked with the North Carolina Association of School Administrators and the School Board Association for North Carolina. She was the legislative director to the State Board of Education at DPI. She was the first president and founder of the Innovation Project, and I encourage you to Google and find out more about that. And she has also been an associate professor at UNC Charlotte. Ann's passion over the last almost 2 decades, Ann, has been archival research into looking at our North Carolina Constitution. And that research led her to talk about constitutional tales. And now all of that has been wrapped into this new video presentation, Let History Speak. And also joining us tonight is Dr. Heather Coons, who is our Research and Communications Director, and she'll be joining me tonight with for a discussion after the film with Ann. But Ann, before we show the video, I was thinking that it would be really nice if you could explain to people, like, how did you get involved in that? What is this all about, and when did it start, and what are we getting ready to see?
Okay. Well, thanks, Yvonne. And I'm so happy to be with all of you tonight. Since posting this presentation on YouTube, this is our very first public conversation. And so I'm not surprised that Yvonne and Public School First are the one who gets the ball rolling. So thank you so much. So this work started back in 2007. So it has been a long time. I was on sabbatical from teaching at UNC Charlotte and was at the School of Government for a year and thought I would do a typical kind of academic research and paper on the origin of the right to education. But in North Carolina, that takes you to 1868 and the Constitutional Convention. And when I started to try and read about the convention, looking at resources from around that time period, what I found was that I couldn't rely on them. They were done by the white supremacists who later came into power, and so that put me into the archives to try and learn about it on my own. And that was the beginning of a completely different kind of project. So as opposed to an academic paper, um, this is a collage, I would say, of various archival documents and letters and things. So that and also different from an academic paper where you are really making an argument and you're just putting forward things to support your argument. The new title for this material of Let History Speak is really about letting history speak to you. And so you see the letters, you see the documents, and you decide for yourself what it means. So that's what this is all about. The most important part of this is what it leads you to think about. It's all meant to spark conversation. That is all it is. And so I'm just so grateful to be here with you all tonight.
Well, and this is exciting because, one of the reasons that I'm so interested in this and wanted to share it with a lot of people in our audience is because of when I watched this, I thought about how important it was to our history in North Carolina, but also to our current situation. So I think that that's what I'm looking forward to discussing with our audience. I hope everybody can stay after the screening. I know some people won't be able to do that, but if you can, stay and join in the conversation with Heather and Ann and I to talk a little bit about, what this film says to us for the future and for the situation in North Carolina to protect our public education. So with that being said, stay if you can, and I'm going to get ready to start the film. And again, thanks everybody for coming, and just give me a second here to logistically switch out the screen here and start the film. Now, remember that you control audio on your end. So if it's not loud enough, please turn it up. And if it's too loud, turn it down. But we're not able to control the sound on your device. But we're going to turn it up as loud as we can here. And we will get this started, and we'll see you soon. All right, guys.
Hello, welcome to this presentation of Let History Speak. I'm Ann McColl. Since 2008, I have given hundreds of presentations across North Carolina, including reenactment performances at the state capitol. I refer to these presentations as constitutional tales, as I use key revisions to the state constitution to explore critical times and influential voices in the state's history. These tales were based on original documents I found in the library and state archives, letters, reports, and legislation. The change in title from Constitutional Tales to Let History Speak reflects a shift in emphasis to address our greater sense of urgency that we learn from history as we live in our own historical period. We have had periods of freedom and possibility, times so hard that it was making a way out of no way, and collisions of hopeful visions with resistance to change. Specifically, I'm referring to these three time periods around 1868, 1901, and 1956. To tell the stories from these time periods, I'm asking my friend and colleague Warren Keyes to join me. Warren has been a part of the live presentations at the state capitol. I'm very grateful, Warren, to you for your help in sharing this history. Welcome.
Thanks, Ann, and I'm truly grateful to you for introducing me to Constitutional Tales and now letting me in on Let History Speak. It is an honor to be a part of this revelatory body of work. So let's begin on a high note. When there was a real sense of freedom and possibility in the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. Because we're going to focus on developments in public schools, let's start before the war, in the mid-1800s. At this time, the state was beginning to commit to the concept of public education. Here's Calvin Wiley, the first superintendent elected by the legislature, as he makes his pitch.
We can never have a thorough and perfect system of instruction adapted to the circumstances of all the people, except at the expense and under the direction of the state. The state alone has the means, and the state, by adopting a wise system, can diminish the cost and make education by a universal system of district schools cheaper than it can be afforded on any other plan. C.H. Wiley, 1854 report.
With our emphasis on letting history speak, I invite you to carefully consider what these historical figures had to say. Does Superintendent Wiley's statement ring true to you? Putting together a system of schools took time. Some communities did not have any schools. Others varied in the length of their school year, salaries for teachers, and the teachers' qualifications. We had to build towards such a system. This is one of Superintendent Wiley's reports around the same time period. It is the beginning of patching a system together. Even with these significant efforts, we also have serious problems. This system that the state is building is not for everyone. It is only for white people, and because it is understood how powerful education is, the state enacted criminal penalties for attempting to educate people who are enslaved. You might imagine that the Civil War would resolve this problem, but instead, the state is in chaos. Those in power are the same people who took the Confederate stance in the Civil War. Rather than serving all children, they are willing to abolish the school system. Less than a year after the Civil War, the General Assembly passed legislation in North Carolina to remove the only two positions that we had in the state. The legislature also eliminated the only designated funds at the state level for public education. And the General Assembly removed any local requirements for providing education. And what was the response of communities? An important one emerged after the war. Black, free, and freedmen assembled at the Freedmen's Convention in Raleigh to chart a path forward. This community in North Carolina was one of the first of its kind in the South to come together. One of the initiatives to come out of this gathering is the creation of the Education Association of the Colored People of North Carolina.
The object of this association shall be to aid in the establishment of schools from which none shall be excluded on account of color or poverty, and to encourage unsectarian education in this state, especially among freedmen.
James Harris, a free man in Raleigh from before the war, pressed this concept forward. He was a prominent leader and was influential in creating an extensive grassroots effort among the newly free black citizens to focus on the need for public education. Now it is time for us to arrive at the state capitol for the 1868 Constitutional Convention. Delegates are elected from their region. What is going to keep the same people who were in power before the Civil War from showing up as delegates? Congress. Having seen the Southern leadership's responses after the Civil War, Congress passed the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867. This act mandated that those who had been loyal to the Confederate cause could not be in power. As a result, the Republican Party, which was known at the time as the anti-slavery, pro-abolition Lincoln Party, wins 107 of the 120 seats. In addition, this is the first time that a significant number of black candidates are elected to serve in an official capacity. Further, this unique coalition will be created with white delegates from both inside and outside of the state. It is fair to say that this is a completely different group of people showing up to change the North Carolina Constitution. This is that sense of freedom and possibility. There are no enslaved and free. All are free. They have the votes. They can do what they think is right for the state. One of these people is Reverend Samuel Stanford Ashley. He came from Rhode Island. He was a preacher and an educator. The Williston School in Wilmington is one of the many schools that he created when he came to North Carolina during the war as part of the American Missionary Association. Now, as a delegate, he chairs the Education Committee, which gives him significant influence on the development of the education section of the Constitution. But here, he is responding to a report from another committee on the first article of the Constitution, the Declaration of Rights. This section includes fundamental rights such as the right to vote, to free speech, and freedom of religion. Delegate Ashley offers an amendment on the floor of the convention.
The people have a right to the privileges of education, and it is the duty of the state to guard and maintain that right.
The provision is accepted. He also proposes that we have a general and uniform system of education using language he found in state constitutions in the Midwest. Together, these provisions capture the concept of the right to education. In 1997, the North Carolina Supreme Court referenced these provisions.
At the time this provision was originally written in 1868, the intent of the framers was that every child have a fundamental right to a sound basic education, which would prepare the child to participate fully in society as it existed in his or her lifetime.
What do you think of that language for support of public education? Something you may hear more about at the state and national level is how courts approach interpretation of constitutions. One method is originalism, which is the concept that courts go back to the time when the Constitution was created or amended and determine the nature and scope of the right based on the circumstances existing then. This approach tends to minimize a right because society has changed so much or grown so much. But look at what they did here. Prepare the child to participate fully in society as it existed in his or her lifetime. Students now face a very different future than those in 1868, yet this interpretation allows the Constitution to move right along with changing educational needs.
Reverend James Walker Hood is another one of the delegates at this constitutional convention. He was a free person before the war. During the war, he comes to North Carolina to establish AME Zion churches. He becomes visible across the state when he presides over the Freedmen's Convention in 1865. In a constitutional convention, it can be just as important what doesn't get passed as what does. Here, conservative voices were seeking to require segregated schools in the Constitution. James Walker Hood vehemently disagrees.
I am opposed to putting it in the organic law. Make this distinction in your organic law, and in many places the white children will have good schools at the expense of the whole people, while the colored people will have none better, or what will be but little than none.
North Carolina was one of the very few southern states that did not provide for segregated schools in its constitution. This will change when white supremacists regain power in the state. But in 1868, after the convention, Ashley, as the first elected state superintendent under the new Constitution, and Hood as assistant superintendent for colored schools will work together toward providing public schools for all students. One of the most thoughtful observers of this time period is W.E.B. Du Bois. He concludes,
"It is fair to say that the Negro carpetbag governments established the public schools of the South."
And so just sit with that for a moment. Many of us haven't heard this part of our history, yet it can change your sense of the story of public education if you understand what has enabled us to move forward.
If you are listening to this presentation because you care about education, then it is important to recognize the enduring constitutional right to public education created in this convention. If you care about governance and democracy, this convention is an extraordinary example of a coalition formed across race, geography, and lived experiences. A question that I hope you will leave this part of the presentation with is, how does having a sense of freedom and possibility for a better future affect what you say and do? Does it lead you to being more creative and bolder? Does one success lead to another success? If instead you feel the weight of the world on your shoulders, if you feel more oppression than freedom, are there things you can do to tap into that energy of possibility?
Let's move forward to our next time period that is captured by the events in 1901. You will see the phrase, "making a way out of no way." This is a civil rights phrase brought to use by Howard Thurman, an African-American Christian theologian who spoke to the Black experience in the United States. The phrase expresses a resolve to address seemingly impossible situations, like when the government intentionally disenfranchises its citizens and creates intentional inequities. We are speaking of the Jim Crow South. This is a time of segregation by law and the use of power by white supremacists to terrorize and intimidate black citizens. Oppression also includes creating barriers to participating in the economy so that black communities disproportionately suffer in their overall health and welfare. The segregation laws were given the blessing of the United States Supreme Court in 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson. This opinion stood for the proposition that separate but equal satisfies the constitutional protections of the 14th Amendment. A revered feature of the justice system is that it provides a means for dissent. This is what Justice Harlan had to say.
But in view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful.
Once again, we can pause to ask ourselves, how does this language resonate today? Leading to 1901, it is important to take note of the high rate of voting participation among black men. If you look at the white male participation, it is mostly in the mid to upper 80%. Black male participation goes all the way up to 98%. It drops into the 60s when terrorists keep them away from the polls. Why did it matter if black males were voting in large numbers? They were able to elect black officials who became a part of the fusionist strategy to promote shared interests, and they were able to elevate their concerns through the political process. White supremacists seeking to regain power tried various tools to suppress the impact of the black male vote, including gerrymandering. Here you can see how districts were shaped over time from reasonable-looking puzzle pieces to strange configurations. In order to isolate black voters into limited districts, while this improved the odds overall for white supremacists, it made it much more difficult to get elected in a district that now was made up of a majority of black voters. This was the circumstance for Charles B. Aycock, who sought to be governor. He advanced another tool, the literacy test. An eligible voter could be asked to read and write any part of the Constitution, and if he failed to do so to the satisfaction of the official, he was denied the opportunity to vote. White men were grandfathered in until the year 1908 so that if they were illiterate, they would have time to learn to read. With this provision, Charles Aycock saw it as a way to incentivize white people to obtain an education and to support public schools. Why would this work? Well, the illiteracy rate among black males is over half, which will help make disenfranchisement possible. Among white males, 1/5 will not be able to vote if they do not learn to read. Here is how Aycock spoke about it in a speech for governor.
We have taught them much in the past 2 years in the University of White Supremacy. We will graduate them in August next with a diploma that will entitle them to form a genuine white man's party. Then we shall have no more revolutions in Wilmington. We shall have no more dead and wounded Negroes on the streets, because we shall have good government in the state and peace everywhere. But to do this, we must disfranchise the Negro. The amendment to the Constitution is presented in solution of the problem. The Democratic Party knows the truth. It is certain that the unlettered white man is more capable of government than the Negro. But the opponents of the amendment attack it on another ground. They say that every child who comes of age after 1908, white and black, must be able to read and write before he can vote. This is true. The schools are open and will be for 4 or more months every year from now to 1908. The white child under 13 who will not learn to read and write in the next 8 years will be without excuse. I tell you that the prosperity and the glory of our grand old state are to be more advanced by this clause than by any other one thing. Speak the truth. Tell it in Gath, tell it in the streets of Ascalon, that universal education of the white children of North Carolina will send us forward in a bound in the race with the world. With the adoption of this amendment after 1908, there will be no state in the Union with a larger percentage of boys and girls who can read and write, and no state will rush forward with more celerity or certainty than conservative old North Carolina.
Was the provision effective in disenfranchising black male citizens? Completely. Voting dropped to literally 0% of black males. This was accomplished by the combination of the literacy test, the discretion given to local agents in administering it, and terrorism at the voting polls. And what about education? Well, it was a big campaign. The Great Campaign for Public Education, as it was called. And you may have heard the phrase of a schoolhouse built every week. That's from this era. Here is one of the news clips from the time period.
Next Monday will be an important day in Anson, the County Board of Education having decreed that all the public schools of the county shall open their doors that day. It is a painful truth that many of our people have not, in the past, taken that lively interest in public education which its important demands. The white parents of the county should be informed that their children, who come of age after 1908, cannot vote unless they can read and write. Surely there is no white parent in Anson County who wishes to see his little boy grow to manhood and not have the privilege of casting a ballot for the party of his choice. The schools are provided for them, and there should be such a strong public sentiment developed that it will be practically impossible for any man to allow his children to grow up in utter ignorance.
The leader of this campaign is the elected state superintendent, James Y. Joyner. He has a full schedule, speaking at rallies and campaigns. He also gives guidance to local superintendents. In response to a letter received from a superintendent, Joyner responds,
"The Negro schools can be run for much less expense and should be. In most places, it does not take more than 1/4 as much to run the Negro schools as it does to run the white schools for about the same number of children. The salaries paid teachers are very properly much smaller. The houses are cheaper, the number of teachers smaller. If quietly managed, the Negroes will give no trouble about it."
So that's the intentional inequities. It answers the question of whether inequities were an intentional strategy or an unforeseen consequence of an agenda. The result of intentional inequity is stark. Here's what it looks like. The 1910 state budget allocates more than 2.5 times as much for white students as it does for black students. And remember that black males are disenfranchised and women have not yet gained the right to vote. It is not possible to use the democratic process for expressing concerns about these inequities. If your back is up against the wall, what do? You might organize to create some political and legal power. The NAACP, founded in 1909, is just getting started in 1910. W.E.B. Du Bois joins them that year as well and effectively uses his role as head of publications and research to further speak to freedom through political rights. One of the areas that the NAACP will address through lawsuits is the failure of school districts to uphold the equal part of the separate but equal language in Plessy versus Ferguson. Another approach in a time period like this is to stay under the radar while moving an agenda forward. That is one way to understand the extraordinary success of the Jeans teachers and why so many of us do not know anything about them. Anna Jeans was a Philadelphia Quaker woman. With her family's fortune, she gave $1 million to improving opportunities for black students, families, and communities in the South by funding African American educators, mostly women, to give guidance and instruction within the white school systems. That $1 million would be about $30 million in today's dollars. The state had a supervisory and coordinating role. The local school system, the superintendent, the white Board of Education, would have to agree to hire the jeans teacher. While it varied from place to place, often the jeans teacher would supervise the education for black students in their segregated schools. The jeans teachers rarely had specific positional authority. In fact, it was important that these teachers could discreetly interact with the white political structure. Even with these limitations, jeans teachers were heavily involved in the hiring and evaluation process, the training of teachers, and establishing curriculum. In essence, they frequently acted as the de facto superintendents of black schools. Perhaps you know of Rosenwald schools. To gain access to the funds for building better schools required support from the black community. Who made that happen? Often, it was the jeans teachers. Carrie Jordan, jeans teacher in Durham, North Carolina, describes the process in her 1924 annual report.
We found many of the schoolhouses in such poor condition that they were really unfit for use. By explaining to the patrons in these communities the splendid offer of Mr. Rosenwald to assist them in obtaining new buildings, much interest was aroused.
And so that's a question that this time period leaves us with. How do you support public education or any other feature of our democracy in a time when those in power are taking away your rights and intentionally creating inequities? When you feel your back is up against the wall, what additional strategies do you consider? How do you build community? How do you maintain your resolve?
We move on to our third time period. Hope meets resistance. In 1956, North Carolina must determine how to respond to the mandates of Brown versus Board of Education. In this unanimous opinion in 1954, the United States Supreme Court declared, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place." Plessy versus Ferguson is overturned in public schools. By doing so, the Supreme Court adopted the dissent written by Harlan and made it the majority opinion. Here is a photo published a few days later. You might recognize the man in the short-sleeved shirt and the tie. That's Thurgood Marshall, a lead legal strategist of the NAACP in dismantling of segregation, who later becomes a Supreme Court justice. You'll see at the top of the slide that the photo comes from the Pittsburgh Courier, the newspaper with the highest number of black subscribers in the country. At the bottom right, you can see a photo attribution giving to Rivera. This is Alex Rivera, a Southern correspondent and photojournalist for the Pittsburgh Courier based in Durham, North Carolina. He is tasked with following the aftermath of the Brown decision. Here are some of his headlines.
Teacher proves integration can work in Tar Heel School. Integration, it does work. U.S. teachers vote yes on integration. Dover High School integrated without any trouble at all. Segregation in West Virginia education is as dead as the dodo bird.
Notice how hopeful these stories are. They offer a shared vision of how we can move forward after Brown. If we only remember what happened, the very slow struggle towards desegregation that was marked with violence and obstruction, then we don't fully appreciate the tension of this time period of hope and resistance.
In North Carolina, some of that resistance comes from Governor Hodges. Part of his strategy is to skirt the opinion by encouraging voluntary segregation, as opposed to segregation by law, and to attack those who challenged him. Here is part of his speech.
In spite of this outstanding record of good race relationships here in North Carolina, we are being made the object of a campaign by an organization which seems determined to destroy our interracial friendship and divide us into camps of racial antagonism. This organization is known as the NAACP. Those who would force this state to choose between integrated schools and abandonment of the public school system will be responsible if, in the choice, we lose the public school system.
And Rivera responds.
The Negro knows that much of his progress is due directly to the relentless struggle of the NAACP to secure his rights. They know that the NAACP fought lynching to a standstill, beat the lily-white primaries, knocked out the all-white juries, won equal salaries for Negro teachers, removed the curtain from trained diners, had declared unconstitutional the restrictive covenant in housing, paved the way for integration in the military, opened the doors of the state universities, and provided other opportunities too numerous to mention. 50 years, the Negro begged for equal facilities guaranteed him under the will-o'-the-wisp, separate but equal law. What did he get for his trouble? Insults, threats, and an educational system that has sealed the genius of generations of Americans.
Not everybody saw it the way Rivera did. Some connect integration with communism. This is a reminder that while Cold War tensions had relaxed some by the mid-50s, it is still an easy trigger for fear. This copy of the newspaper belonged to Wesley Kurtz George. He was a professor in the anatomy department at the University of North Carolina. Reminiscent of the efforts during World War II, George sought to provide a scientific basis for white superiority as a basis for defying Brown. He creates a 7-page document called Race, Heredity, and Civilization. Here is one excerpt from it.
When we bring young people of the two races together in intimate social relationship, we promote the protoplasmic mixing of the races. This will result, as generations come and go, in the production of an ever-increasing proportion of mixed-breed people and a lessening of pure strains. In my judgment, one of the consequences will be the deterioration and probable destruction of the creative genius of our people.
George is successful in reaching powerful audiences.
Your stand on segregation will, in my humble judgment, reflect more credit on the University of North Carolina than anything that has happened in many years. Feel at liberty, please, to suggest to me at any time how I can help you in your fine work.
That's Rodman. He is the head of the Finance Committee, one of the most powerful committees in the General Assembly.
I have greatly enjoyed reading your article entitled Race, Heredity, and Civilization. The article is an excellent contribution to this subject, and I hope it will be widely read.
That's I. Beverly Lake, who later runs for governor.
I have read with much interest your statement entitled Race, Heredity, and Civilization.
That's Sam Ervin, U.S. Senator from North Carolina, who becomes an important contributor in fashioning a response to Brown from Southern congressmen. Even school boards express an interest.
Some time ago, you were gracious enough to send me a copy of your paper, Race, Heredity, and Civilization. It is excellent and quite thought-provoking. As we are face-to-face with this in our Charlotte School Board, I would like to have 12 copies of this paper for use with our school board and administration.
In this tension of hope and resistance, we should note that Southern whites are out of sync with the rest of the country. Looking at Southern whites, the approval of Brown is just 16%. Disapproval, 80%. If we look outside the South, we see something very different. 71% approve of Brown, 24% disapprove. This creates a challenge for Southern leaders. They don't want the federal government to withhold education funding for failure to comply with Brown. Many Southern congressmen also held powerful seats in committees and did not want to risk losing their positions. The collective decision is to prepare what became known as the Southern Manifesto. It has no legal significance, but Southern congressmen would sign on to the document that would be included in the congressional record. It would be their explanation to the world, a message to stay out of our business in the South. North Carolina Senator Sam Ervin is a chief architect of the manifesto.
The signatories have shown that serious, conservative, level-headed Southerners, not just a hot-headed few, are opposing the court's decision in a cool, deliberate manner.
Here is a brief excerpt from the manifesto.
We regard the decision of the Supreme Court in the school cases as a clear abuse of judicial power. It climaxes a trend in the federal judiciary undertaking to legislate in derogation of the authority of Congress and to encroach upon the reserved rights of the states and the people.
Not everybody signs, but most of them did. 82 of 106 congressmen signed, 19 of the 22 senators. Many of the southern states express unanimous approval. Texas is the outlier in low participation. In North Carolina, 9 of the 12 sign on to the manifesto. If we look more closely at these three, Harold Cooley is a lawyer who essentially agrees with the sentiment of the document, but disagrees with certain passages. Charles Dean opposes on principle.
I do not have to remain in Washington, but I do have to live with myself. I shall not sign my name to any document which will make any man, anywhere, a second-class citizen.
That's the Harlan dissent, isn't it? Does it still ring true? And here is Thurman Chatham, a prosperous business owner and war veteran who had served multiple terms in Congress.
I personally will not sign anything that will tear down the power and prestige of the court as the final arbiter of justice. We sometimes forget that in a country ruled by a dictator, the courts are destroyed first.
We can ask the same question. Does this ring true? And many people appreciate their courage. Thurman Chatham's files in the state archives held many such letters. Here are a few.
Please let me express my deep appreciation for the courageous stand you have taken with regard to the recent manifesto. Your words are words of wisdom and statesmanship. You will face bitter criticism, as you are aware, but you have much, very much support and gratitude.
Us duckers and trouters are right proud of the way you spoke up on the Southern Manifesto. In an election year, it required a good deal of courage and character to take the unpopular side of such an emotional issue. I have an idea many congressmen and senators simply added their names to the list rather than buck the tide.
I'm a school teacher, and I find it hard to teach students to obey and respect our laws when at the same time many of our political leaders are openly showing very little respect for our laws.
Refusing to sign the manifesto came at a cost to them. With what would otherwise have been easy primaries, they both lost their elections. Due to race. While these issues are playing out in Congress, North Carolina must develop a response to Brown. The General Assembly creates a committee commonly known as the Pearsall Committee based on the name of the chair, Thomas Pearsall. Its formal name is the North Carolina Advisory Committee on Education. Here is one of the memos during their deliberation.
We believe that the task before us is to see to preserve education itself, not just a public school system. We believe that history will record that the friends of education in this trying time were those who took a realistic view of this problem and were willing, if necessary, to try new and drastic measures in order to preserve education for all our people. We recognize the possibility that as a last-ditch measure, the public school system might be abolished, fine though it is.
Several months later, in April, they issue their final plan. This will require an amendment to the Constitution and legislation to implement the plan. The plan calls for local school assignment using voluntary school segregation. The plan also includes what they call a safety valve, publicly funded grants to attend non-sectarian schools to avoid a child attending a school with mixed races, or what we might now call vouchers. In addition, it would give a local unit authority to suspend operation of public schools. Once again, North Carolina is willing to sacrifice providing a general and uniform system of schools to avoid integration. A special session of the General Assembly is held in July to seek approval of the legislation and authorization of a vote by the people on the constitutional amendments. In the archival files for Governor Hodges, there is a hefty stack of correspondence regarding the proposal. One comes from an anonymous, disappointed Hodges supporter.
Due to family and political reasons, I cannot sign this letter. Furthermore, if I see you tomorrow, I will assume the obsequious role required of a man in my position. At least, I am not deceiving myself. I am a hypocrite, and I know it. You may convince yourself that you are on the side of truth and right, but don't ever think that you will fool the historians of the future. They will see you for what you are, one of a group of misguided souls that fought sincerely, but nevertheless in ignorance and without foresight, to hold back the progress of a great nation.
Irving Carlisle, by contrast, is open about his views. In 1954, Governor Umstead had tapped him to take the vacancy in the U.S. Senate. 2 days after the Supreme Court issued Brown, Carlisle ended a speech to the state Democratic Convention with a brief statement that the state should follow the directives of the Supreme Court. The comment cost him his seat. Sam Ervin filled the vacancy instead. 2 years later, as a prominent citizen and lawyer, he expresses his concern about the Pearsall Plan. This particular speech is 20 pages long. Perhaps attention spans were different back then. Here is a brief excerpt.
In the atmosphere largely created here at Chapel Hill and by our public schools, the people of North Carolina are accustomed to making up their own minds on public questions, from the mandatory duty to operate free public schools for all of the children to the permissive privilege to close them in any given locality is a long backward step that ought never to be taken by North Carolina. As we struggle with this problem of the races, we should always remember that we now live in a changing world that is a community made up of peoples that are preponderantly non-white. To live with our consciences, we must be willing to let others live up to the rights given to them by law.
At the joint session of the General Assembly, Governor Hodges addresses the legislators. His speech is about 30 minutes long. This is actual audio tape from the session.
Mr. President, Mr. Speaker, and members of the General Assembly, we face tonight one of the greatest crises which North Carolina has ever experienced, and affecting at this moment the lives of over 1 million school children in our state. Do not expect us to stand idly by, as some have suggested, while our public schools are ruined in the course of a sociological experiment sought to be carried out at the expense of our children. Let us consider for a few minutes the original source of the trouble that has made this special meeting of the General Assembly necessary. I refer, of course, to the Supreme Court of the United States and its school segregation decision. As you know, the 1954 decision by the Supreme Court overturned an interpretation of some 60 years standing, placed upon the 14th Amendment by that court to the effect that separate but equal facilities did not violate the terms of equal protection contained in that amendment. We're going to use every legal means we can devise to ensure the effect that what we feel is an erroneous decision by the Supreme Court are not forced on this state in a fashion which would deprive us of our dearest possessions, namely our public schools. Our answer is we believe the overwhelming majority of parents can be relied upon to do what they think is best for their children. Furthermore, if conditions are ever so bad in a community that the people will vote to suspend the operation of their schools, then conditions are so bad.
The General Assembly approves the plan. Voters approve the constitutional amendment. Remember that this is before federal enforcement of voting rights, so few black voters would have participated. One more observation. Creating these plans and reports is an opportunity to tell a version of history. Here is a version included in the Pearsall Plan report.
The white race has been almost wholly responsible for the creation, development, and support of an educational system which has been and is now educating the Negro children of the state, all of them.
By paying attention to history, we know another version by W.E.B. Du Bois.
This brings us to reflect on the time period around 1956. What would it be like to be a voice for public education in a time when you have a hopeful vision and those who are in control are resistant to change? Or we could simply say, what would it be like to have a hopeful vision when those who are in control are resistant to change? And now, we can reflect on our own time period. How would you characterize the time we are living in now? What does it mean to be a courageous leader now? What would it look like to be an engaged citizen now?
That is for you to decide. You and your colleagues, you and your community. This presentation is about how to let history speak to us. How will listening to these voices help us as we make history together? Here are some ways to think about it, including the particular messages from 1868, 1901, and 1956. If we let history speak, we can learn how change happens. The courts have upheld the education provisions in the Constitution. The Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965 renders the literacy test invalid, although it remains in the North Carolina Constitution. The Pearsall Plan is ruled unconstitutional, and it is eliminated when the Constitution is substantially rewritten in 1971. That's not a bad track record. Sometimes the arc is long. When Harlan wrote the dissent in 1896, he had no way to know if it would ever make a difference. When you're in the minority, you don't know. It's 58 years later when his dissent becomes the majority in Brown versus Board of Education. It's 100 years later that the rights of those who are gay are also found premised on Harlan's dissent.
When history speaks, it reminds us of community. How are people coming together to support each other, to build a hopeful vision, to strategize, to act? I just do not know of a better example of people building community in difficult circumstances than the Jeans teachers. If they could build community, so can we.
If we let history speak, it usually draws us back to our fundamental principles. In Leandro versus State in 1997, they're reaching back 109 years to the language. We're now 157 years, or maybe later as you contemplate this, since that language was first written. The children who show up in our schools for an education have changed. Yet our fundamental principle for helping all students to prepare to live fully in society during their lifetimes has not.
And lastly, if we let history speak, we will hear an invitation to join. That is, an invitation to join authentic leaders who have the courage of their convictions, to consider what is possible in the times in which we live. This slide looks a little tight, but they will make room for you. Thank you.
So sorry, everyone. We had a little power surge and we lost the video and we had to recoup. And I thankfully did not lose my cool. I think that's what happens when you have 3 kids and a bunch of grandkids, that you learn how to roll with, oh my gosh, the power's out. Okay, so here we are, we're back. Heather, I'm going to let you start us off.
Well, I have a whole bunch of questions, but the one that sticks out to me the most actually is coming from the end, you know, letting history speak. And then you mentioned Leandro, and Anne, I know you have such deep knowledge about the legal situation that we're in right now. What strikes you? You know, we're more than a year out from the last oral arguments on Leandro, and you know this history so well. What really strikes you about this moment? Because it feels like in another 50 years, people are going to be looking back at, you know, the way we look at the 1950s. They're going to be looking at this time period that we're in right now in some ways and what's happening. And some of the speeches where they're talking about what was happening and saying, oh, parents know what's best for their kids. Those are things that I hear legislators saying today, you know, to propose vouchers again. So share some of your thoughts with us, please. I'm sure there's just so many you have on this. It's fascinating.
Well, thanks, Heather, for the question. You know, we are at that point where each month we're waiting to see if the decision comes out.
Yeah.
And maybe with Justice Riggs keeping her seat on the Supreme Court, maybe that settles things a little bit in the Supreme Court. Maybe that will help. We don't know. But when it comes out, I think what's so important about this history is that we're prepared. And we know it's a long arc and it's not always going in the same direction. So, you know, 1868 was great. 1901, 1956, not good. And so, and yet, you know, there were people who were doing really important work in those time periods, right? And so, you know, whether we do important work is not dependent on what the Supreme Court does. That depends on our imagination and our commitment to do the work. So, you know, I think that as we wait for the decision, it's getting clear on our fundamental values and our willingness to fight for those wherever we need to do that, whether it's in the courts or the General Assembly or in community. We just need to be prepared and ready to go.
So Yvonne, I just want to let everybody know, if you have questions for Anne, go ahead and put them in, are they putting them in the chat or in the Q&A? Did we say that? All righty. Okay. So in all of your research, Anne, what were you finding and I'm sure it was very different in the different time periods, but we have the court cases happening, which is a focus here, right? Which of course that's essential, but there was also so much work happening on the ground. And with the changeover of the political figures.
Yeah.
And that was really essential in, in the developing policies around these court cases and things like that. So what were you finding to be most inspirational or powerful in terms of moving things forward in a positive way for public education for everybody and more equal access to quality education?
I'll highlight something from each of the time periods based on what you saw. The coalition that came together in 1868, I mean, they were ready. They wanted to do everything they possibly could. And you see it in the extraordinary constitution they created. And, in this presentation, I don't go into as much depth, but, in looking at constitutions across the country, ours is as good or better than any other constitution. That came out of 1868. So that sort of initiative, and of course, Ashley and Hood then go into into political office, right? So Hood gets elected Ashley gets elected as our first state superintendent. Hood comes in, and off they go. So it's that sort of, for them, what I admire is their momentum, that seizing the moment, the sense of possibility, and off they go. In 1901, the political system was shut off, right? It was complete oppression. And so what I admire there is, so they create the NAACP. That comes out of complete oppression. And without the NAACP, we wouldn't have Brown versus Board, right? So it's so I admire the people who are willing to come together for that kind of fight. I equally admire the Jeans teachers, because so what I love about this is that as we each think of our own gifts, our own sense of what it is that we can do, maybe you're that very political person and you hear the NAACP and it's like, yep, I could do something. I could do the 2025 version of that. Maybe that's not you. And the Jeans teachers shows that pragmatic, under the radar, and they are really getting things done. 1956 is a bit of a shutout. What I appreciate there are those dissenting voices. And, we saw congressmen losing their seats in order to stand up for what they believed in. Irving Carlisle lost the ability to have a seat. You see people with the NAACP who, anything for them would have been very risky, including the journalists. And so it's that courage to stand to your convictions that I really admire so much from that time period.
Can you talk a little bit more about the Jeans teachers and some of the strategies under the radar that they were using, that, and then how that emerged and really helped change things?
So, they are being brought into the white school system, but they are going to work with the black schools. And white superintendents, either out of very good intention or out of a sense of neglect, were willing to let them go and do their own thing. And so what we see if you look at their reports, you will find that they were doing what we now call place-based education. They were connecting their students to their community. They were giving their students a sense of possibility. It's all the things that we now say are great, but we can look back at those reports and see what they were doing. And they also, something that we haven't seen in our system as much in the last decades, is teachers being so connected into their community and helping their community, for example, get the Rosenwald schools, but also health issues, all sorts of things. They were, the connection that they made between the school and the community was really extraordinary and absolutely deserves to be replicated today. And I do want to do a shout out that, based on this research, North Carolina, Creed NC has a whole program of bringing to light their work. And the Flood Center at the Public School Forum actually has a Jeans Fellows program where they have reimagined that work for 2025. And so it's very exciting to see us honor these Jeans teachers. And what would have, remember, they're in the Jim Crow South, and it would have been a very scary time to be doing anything. And so I always think, if they could do it, surely we can.
Very good. I want to just check if anyone has a question, you can raise your hand or you can put your question in the chat. One of the things that Heather said earlier, and I just wanted to circle back to just for a second, is that this whole notion of using vouchers or private schools or money to go to private schools as a way to circumvent public school and what that might represent to you, that's really, people are shocked to find out that that's not something that's just started happening here in North Carolina or across the nation.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're pretty shocked to find out this is kind of an old strategy, or one that actually just never went away. I mean, what do you think?
Right. So I think that willingness to erode the public school system, we first see that around the Civil War time, where the progress that had been made, they're willing to dismantle it to avoid integration. Then we see that strategy come back in a more sophisticated version in 1956 with the Pearsall Plan. And for sure, I mean, we actually, so the laws that we have for private schools and homeschools come out of that time period. So we truly have the root of what we do now for homeschools, private schools, comes from this period. And so when we think about vouchers now, it is looking back to how we did things then. And so it's definitely not a new strategy. Yeah.
You know,
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, it seemed pretty important that the Pearsall plans and, the avoidance of integration was deemed unconstitutional, in 1966 and then 1971 and all of that. Given that this strategy, we're back in another cycle right now, and the degradation and the dismantling of public education is pretty explicit in some areas, and it's certainly happening in North Carolina. We can see it every legislative session. What do you see from your perspective as some roadblocks, that the kinds of roadblocks that were put in place previously? Do you see anything like that happening now, or is it really just going to come from different elected officials making decisions? What are your thoughts on that?
So, and when you say roadblocks, you mean to keep the vouchers from happening or to allow them to happen?
To keep them from expanding. So I'm saying, like, the courts said that was unconstitutional. We had Brown v. Board, and then the later decisions. Are you seeing something like that, given like the push on the religious, spending public money on religious schools? It doesn't seem to be going in the favor of public funds going to public schools for the immediate.
Thank you. Yeah, so we did, including I was at NCAE at the time when the voucher legislation went through, and so part versus state was our case, and that in a companion case brought by the School Board Association, we lost, and those were a little bit more of a facial challenge, meaning on just reading the statute does it sound is it unconstitutional? What we have now, now that they are in operation, we can look for those times that in operation, we can look for ways in which it's discriminatory in a way that is against the law, against the Constitution. So those are possible. And if not the courts, then of course we're back to the General Assembly. Right? And we have a Supreme Court right now that is pretty deferential to the General Assembly. And so I have to say the better option is to try and work with the composition of the General Assembly to affect vouchers.
Do you keep track of what's happening in other states, and are you seeing room for optimism I know there's some discouraging things happening, but are you seeing some room for optimism? I guess Illinois just ended their voucher program, so that's good.
Yeah, I
Anything
think
else?
I don't keep a close watch on it, so I can't kind of identify what's happening in a particular state. But I think again, what you're looking for is there a court that's saying you've gone too far? You've gone too far on public purpose kind of issues or discriminatory issues. Or the public essentially saying to their General Assembly, you've gone too far and we want to back off on that. So that's what I think we're watching for. And and to just kind of paint the whole picture, what we're trying to think about is public schools that are in our school districts that all children are entitled to, charter schools, homeschools, vouchers that take you to private schools. So I think one of the things that we really have to pay attention to is the dynamics that happen in that environment. And I do think one of the things that I always encourage people in public schools to do is look for opportunities to listen to these parents who are making other choices and see how we can reimagine public schools to better meet their needs. So I always want us to be open to ways to be better, right? And if people are leaving the public schools, we want to ask those questions of why and what can we do better.
Very good and great question and great conversation. And I would call everybody back to this in kind of a more of a closing way. In the North Carolina Constitution, if you have a few minutes, go look at it, look at Article 9. And one of the things that's remarkable to me, that is written in 1868 to say that every resident of North Carolina, every child is entitled to a free public education. And so some of us who are worried and not supportive of vouchers see that, that mandate is been lost in the shuffle here. That when you think about that every child's enabled to that, then it seems like that's kind of a covenant that's written in our Constitution with taxpayers saying you need to pay for a free basic education. This is part of our Constitution, it's part of our public good, so forth. And that so then, our extension of that is that taking money from the public system and putting it into a private system, defies the intent and meaning of our Constitution. Any thoughts on that from your perspective as a legal scholar as well as a constitutional and education law scholar?
So I think you're right. We do look to the Constitution and we have great provisions in Article 9 and Article 1, our Declaration of Rights. And what I think is also valuable to notice is this intertwining with democracy. So part of the reason that we value the public education is it's also accountable to the public, right? It is an education for those children, but it's because we believe that education will help students thrive and it will help communities thrive. And so we really can't undo, and we shouldn't want to, that connection between democracy and public education. And so as we are looking at the landscape of where we are right now, we really have to pay attention to both. We won't keep public education if we don't keep democracy, and vice versa.
That's an excellent point to make, and almost something that I think that we have forgotten about. And one of the things that Heather and I do is look at a lot of data about school systems and counties, and what we found, and no one's surprised about, right? Like in 96 or 97 of the 100 counties in North Carolina, public school system is one of the top 3 employees.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not just the social cornerstone in a community, they are the economic cornerstone in the community. So that's pretty remarkable, and especially as we look in our smaller, more rural, suburban counties, this is absolutely true. Many of those counties are number one. They're the number one employer. And so I think that's also part of what you're saying, that they're so tied to the community, not only as educational, social, but an economic engine for the things that happen there. And that's pretty scary to think of losing those. As we kind of wrap up, Heather, did you have any other questions? I know that.
Well, this is a question that I wish I'd asked earlier on. It kind of goes a little bit off of the thread that we're on right now, but there were so many fascinating people in this program and that I didn't know about. I mean, I knew some of the history, you know, I've been trying to learn over the years, but I just learned so much and it's just so fascinating to me. So I want to know what really sticks out to you the most in terms of inspiration. I asked you about the genes teachers already. So something in addition to that, that maybe we can end on a really hopeful and positive note in terms of people you found. It doesn't have to be one person, but just particular moments maybe, or people that you found particularly encouraging or inspiring, or that you want to just share from all your great work.
That last slide or so that has all the images of people on there, I enjoyed putting that together and seeing all of their faces together. And I think about them all the time.
I bet.
And there's something of, they are all so courageous, so inspirational, that I encourage all of us to have a sense of some of those people. And maybe, you know, for anyone listening, there's someone that really caught your attention. That's wonderful. If there wasn't anyone on this presentation, find someone else. But we're not alone, right? I mean, there is that standing on the shoulders of others. And so, you know, at times I've oriented the presentation almost even more directly to this notion of heroes and this idea of what does it mean to be courageous. And so if I'm talking to educators, I really want them to think about what it means to be a courageous educator. If I'm talking to citizens, is what does it mean to be a courageous citizen? I mean, we all have this opportunity to be our best selves as we are dealing with this. And so, yeah, I mean, I do the kind of, what would Hood think, and what would Du Bois think, and what would those genes teachers think? What would Carrie Jordan, one of them, what would she do in this situation? I mean, they are all sources of inspiration to me.
That's a really great, but let me say in closing a few, share a few things here. Hold on one second. I want to share this really fast. And here's a heroine that all this. And I thought this was when I read this, and I thought this is really what, to me, the message of this whole series of work you've done and this video and all the things you've done over the last 20 years is, no matter how hard a time period has been, North Carolinians have always shown up to promote public education and democracy. And I think that's a really important message, and one that we can end on tonight. That for us that are worried about public education, that we've seen the last almost 2 decades be kind of a constant undermining and attacking and underfunding, and the fallout from all of those kind of, you know, campaigns. And we're worried about is what's going to happen to our school systems and what kind of school system we're going to have in the next 5 to 10 years. Well, this is what I'm going to put my hat on, that people are going to show up, that they are going to promote, and that a lot of our community members, as we continue to share information like this, and, you know, our goal is to educate, to inform, to make sure that North Carolinians understand what's at stake, what's going on, so they can make up their own mind. And we think that once they understand, in fact, national poll after poll, even in polls in North Carolina, have shown is that when people really understand what's at risk in public schools and what's going on with the voucher program, they don't support vouchers. They support and love their public schools. So we're going to keep doing that work. We are so appreciative of your being here. We're going to share this kind of widely. To our audience, we want to encourage you to be a part of this work, right? Like we're just a small group of people who are working very hard to educate and inform our folks all across the state. So please go to our website, sign up to get our newsletter. Comes out every week. We make sure you know what's going on, what legislative issues are happening, what policy changes, funding issues. We're in all the social media sites. So join us on Facebook, join us on TikTok, and this recording of this tonight will be on our YouTube channel, so you can share it with your friends and family. And really, we invite you to be a part of that group of North Carolinians that stand up to promote public education and democracy. So thank you again, Heather, for your insightful questions tonight. Thank you, Ann. We could talk to you all night. Your answers are so provocative. It makes me want to think of 4 or 5 more questions to ask you, but in the spirit of time, we're going to let you go. So thank you again for coming. Thank you to our guests, and join us. We need everybody in this fight to protect North Carolina's system of free, high quality public education for every child. Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.